Okay, we're gonna get started. I think there's a couple people trickling in, but after after lunch. Okay, this afternoon is a big science segment for everybody. So it's gonna be great. Ask a lot of questions, write things down. It is recorded for you to go watch after the fact, because I will say a lot of it is overwhelming sometimes and might go over your head the first time. So definitely stop and ask questions. But first topic is our very own Rachel.
Sorry, Ingrid's a lot taller than I am, so, and I have to stand away because I'm a very animated talker. Nancy knows, yeah. And so I will hit the mic at least once during this chat. So I mentioned earlier, I'm a pharmacist by training, so I'm a clinical pharmacist by training, and I practiced in the clinic for 15 years before Rory came along, and so I really enjoy drugs. So, and have actually found that even more since I've left clinical practice, how much I enjoy them in so many ways. So, Bud's never having me over to his house again. So this is actually a follow-up. We did drug repurposing as one of the first things we did as a foundation, and this is pretty commonly done in the rare disease space with a lot of different disorders. So that's what this talk is, and I've got like 30 slides, but they didn't give me any extra time. I got 15 minutes, and now I have like 13. So here we go. Oh yeah, I have to do this because I'm actually going to talk about drugs. So this is my mandatory disclaimer that all of the information in this document is for educational, informational purposes only and not intended to substitute talking to your medical professional, yada, yada, yada. So why are we doing drug repurposing? So this is something we funded a few years ago. This is going to change a lot, right? We already know this. NARS1 doesn't have a treatment. That is essentially every single rare disorder does not have a treatment. So a lot of ways of looking at drug repurposing is maybe it's the fastest way to get something to help ameliorate symptoms, right? It typically does not target the underlying cause of the disorder, but it targets the pathways, right, or the indirect ways. And so this is one of the ways that we went down, one of the reasons we went down the route, along with if you're developing something novel, new, it's probably going to get a lot faster now with AI, but typically 10 to 15 years. Very rarely does it succeed, and it costs billions of dollars to run clinical trials. And so that's the other reason we've looked at this. And so this is what can we kind of do today while we are looking at ASOs, we're looking at gene replacement therapy that take a lot longer and require a lot more, safety data and other things to go. So, and cost. So we partnered with Prolara Labs. They use yeast models. So again, we've been on the yeast train for, that sounds awful, a very long time. And so this is a kind of give you a picture of, what a yeast model might look like. And so this actually looks better than the ones that were tried in Prolara, which were like knockouts. They basically take the whole yeast gene that represents NARS1 out. But you can see here, at least in the cells right across where it's undiluted, sort of those white circles, that's yeast growing. And where they have the P dots, which Shelby was asking about earlier, those are specific variants in that model. And you can see where they're black or they're little specks, that's the yeast not growing, right? So that's the first thing we can tell is like when you disrupt something in yeast, in NARS1, it's bad, right? And so what they do then is they get these models and then they take a library of drugs. So Prolara uses a target model library. It's about 8,000 different drugs and supplements, and they throw them on top of that bad growing yeast, and they watch the yeast and categorize it and see how it grows. And so what they're looking for, right, is ultimately for those black wells, right, to now become, white wells, so that you're seeing a rescue, right? You're seeing the yeast recover from whatever drugs they're putting on there. And then they plot this on these really colorful graphs over here. But essentially, this is the data that we received on the right. We received oodles of it, but this kind of gives you an idea. Like the gray is sort of the maximum control, and those little orange dots are where there was success in getting the yeast to grow. So we did that in 2024. Does that sound right, Terry? 2024, maybe? Somewhere around then. And we got a bunch of data. And so now we were trying to figure out like what to do with it. So myself and Kit, who was on our board for a time, we're both pharmacists in a background. We looked at kind of our top hits and looked at, okay, what's feasible, what's safe. We had a ton of supplements and nutraceuticals. That makes things really complicated. And then I've had many pharmacy students now look at literature and review things to see availability of those things in the market. And then we presented some of that information to researchers and families last year in Croatia. And then we just funded a $50,000 grant to Jenica. She can't be here today, but she's coming in on Zoom later to essentially test a lot of those in different models. And so, like looking at specific variants in models and to see how they respond. And so that's ongoing work now. And then the other thing I did since then is really looking at the top hits for other additional opportunities, safety, pediatric data, everything like that. So this is kind of how I look at all of this stuff. So this is the data and the information. The type of information you get back when you do these screens is you basically get a giant spreadsheet with chemical names on them. And in their OTCs, right, over-the-counter drugs, nutraceuticals, things that are generic prescription drugs, things that are in clinical development, so they're not even on the market yet, they're just being tested, or there's things that are approved, but they hold a patent, so they're available only as a brand name prescription, and so they can be incredibly expensive. And then I do this, so this is what I do. Is I look at all of that list of drugs and I try to think about where does that fit in our space of, is it toxic, right? If I gave that to a human, would they live? Because sometimes you get like arsenic on these lists, right? So we're not giving children arsenic. That would be a bad decision. I look at whether or not it's available, it's safe. If there's data in pediatrics, it's been studied in any diseases, if it's been studied in neurological diseases. And then I think about how toxic it is in terms of how much monitoring do you have to do? Do you have to have blood tests done all the time? How many drug interactions does it have? And then I think about the things that are in the preclinical space or might be less accessible. So that's been my approach to NARS1. I've done this in multiple other rare genetic diseases too. And so that's, then I get to, okay, what can we do today? So I'm actually going to give you 3 therapeutics today that I've looked at. I've had my pharmacy students put together a ton of data and information on, and go through what I think they're doing and what we think they're doing in NARS1, and then, whether or not that's something that might be helpful or useful to you guys as family members. So the first one on our list is amantadine. Amantadine has been around for 40, 50 years. It actually was developed for flu, and it's an antiviral, but it's junky. We actually use it now almost exclusively in like Parkinson's. Interestingly, it's also been studied in children in autism. So we have data and information. What we think it's doing is this is your neuron here at the top, right? And it's coming down to your postsynaptic neuron on the bottom. You have this receptor called NMDA there. So part of it is it's blocking that, and it's allowing more dopamine to kind of be in that synapse, in that open space there, and more of that to flow through the other side, right? And it's blocking some of the like glutamate or this excitatory neurons, which are what's responsible for seizures when there's too much of that. And so it's giving more dopamine to the other side. We see, like in Parkinson's, this is why it's used. It helps with movement and that less sort of disruptive, right? Movement behavior that we see in a lot of our kids, right? And how they're kind of teetering around, or they have a hard time, right, grasping, picking things up, especially like tiny little things. So it should like similarly work that way. This is how it's been studied. So like I said, there's oodles of data for amantadine. It's been studied a lot in Parkinson's syndrome. It's been studied in kids in a couple of really small studies for autism. It's very well tolerated. We generally don't monitor things, but sometimes your doctor might. This is available as a prescription directly from a physician, and it does come in a capsule and a suspension. The suspension is usually more costly than the capsule. The capsule is. And here's just, again, a quick breakdown of the key studies, which is autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, other behavioral ones. And they've had some improvement in some of the behavioral changes or irritability that you might see. And at higher doses, though, you see more irritability or more anxiety, which would make sense because you're getting too much dopamine floating around. And then AT, which is a disorder, it's an inherited disorder that involves a lot of gross and fine motor skills, just like what we see in our kids. So it's always cool when I get to see something that translates across that, and it's helped in movement and coordination. So we know that there's data and information that exists out there in children. So, and then the second drug, how much time do I have? Not any. I'm going to have to go real fast. This isn't even a drug. This is a supplement called luteolin. It's actually, what it really does is work as an anti-inflammatory in a lot of ways. So it's held in the cell, and it tries to temper that inflammatory process that's occurring. And so in a lot of the neurodevelopmental diseases, it's widely accepted that there's a lot of just chronic inflammation that's happening just as a result or as a compensatory mechanism, right? NARS1 is also directly involved in inflammatory cascades with the integrated stress response, which I think you'll hear from folks today. So we have probably two things kind of going on. One that's very directly related to what NARS1 does and what it regulates, and one that's also probably a result of what's happening as the body's trying to compensate for the things that are being disrupted. So it's affecting that inflammatory environment. The other thing that it does, which is not as widely studied, is it helps with glucose and sugar moving into cells. And so your cells need sugar for energy and function. And so that's a less understood mechanism, but it's a pretty plausible one. So again, this is a dietary supplement. So this is over the counter. Supplements in this country are not regulated. They're better regulated in the UK. They're better regulated in Europe. They're better regulated in Australia. But here we have no standards for, Ingrid's laughing at me. No standards. We have no standards or no requirements for if you want to produce a supplement or a nutraceutical in terms of like how you manufacture it, the type of environment you manufacture it. And so that's like the first thing that I always look for when I'm looking at these is, can I find a source that is from a reputable company? Do they do third-party testing? Do they look for contaminants? Like all of the other things that you need to make sure that you're doing from a safety perspective. It has been fairly well studied by essentially a single physician or group, and has these like products that they've specifically studied and formulated. Again, very well tolerated, comes in all kinds of different formulations and drops, capsules. You can open the capsules, you can put it on food, like all of that. So we know all of this information already and how it's been studied and monitored. And because of the way the way we know it's been studied, again, in autism spectrum disorder, which is where we're going to find almost all of our studies in children, is in especially neurological disorders, is with autism or behavioral issues. And so in both of those studies, there were some small improvements in daily functioning, irritability, and the other thing is with gut function and response. And so your gut is considered your second brain, right? First brain, second brain. You have a lot of the same things, receptors, activity that happen here, that also happen here. And so there's some thought that if you help improve some of the inflammation and activity that's dysfunctional in your gut, that you can have some other improvements in, function, in daily life. And then the last supplement I'm mentioning is acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is another supplement, nutraceutical over the counter. Again, multiple thought of mechanisms. Like one of the big ones, though, is keeping sort of cellular function, right? So the cell wall in good standing and in good tact, so that the activities inside the cell can work the way they're supposed to. The other thing that it is doing is increasing acetylcholine, which is another neurotransmitter, and likely some small bits of dopamine as well. So it's, again, got multiple activities. On our drug hit list, if you will, we see a lot of the same repetitive information around dopamine and acetylcholine, very commonly in terms of the therapeutics that have been identified and what they're doing. So it starts thinking about, there's a theme that's going on that helps us maybe understand what else might be going on with NARS1. The other thing that we see is around glucose and around movement of glucose or sugar. So again, I look at everything purely from a drug standpoint and work my way backwards, but there's themes from the list of the drugs that I've seen or the supplements that I've seen. And then the work that other people are doing makes puzzle pieces start fitting into things. So acetylcholine, again, supplement. So you have to have all of these good standards. It still has been studied in adults and in kids. Acetylcholine has been studied down to neonates, which is essentially like your first few days of life for hypoxic ischemia. So essentially, if your baby's born and they don't get enough oxygen to their brain, right? This has been studied that way. So we know that there's data down to the smallest, most vulnerable, individuals. And they've actually looked at milestone improvements. If a baby has received acetylcholine at birth and seen them start to hit milestones faster than if they've never received it and they've had the same brain injury at birth. So it's some pretty powerful data when you can read some of that, information. Again, very well tolerated, and it typically does not need to have any blood work or monitoring done. And then it's also the bigger studies that have been done in the adults have largely been in like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and eye diseases, which I was just talking to somebody about. This is like a mini brain because it's all closed. So you can see a lot and understand a lot that's happening in the eye. It's pretty diffusely available from different companies through powder or drops, although I'm still waiting to hear back from this company about their third-party testing. They haven't got back to me yet. I do outreach all of these companies and ask for things. And how can I give it? And can I put it in applesauce, or can I put it in yogurt or anything? So I know the first two you can open the capsules. The nootropics powder doesn't taste like anything. It can go on everything. You just have to buy it. You have to have a scale for it. Again, the studies that I've mentioned, autism. This is how it's been studied. The dose has been studied. They didn't actually see clinical benefit in those particular symptoms, but it was very well tolerated. And so sometimes we learn a lot just from knowing something's well tolerated in these studies. But as I already mentioned, like it's been studied in infants from like the day they're born when they have an issue. And then the last thing, which Ingrid already talked about, was asparagine. So I'm putting this in here as our other therapeutic. So this paper was just published out of Ilka Heinemann's lab. Tristan Samuels is the lead author, and then Jenica, who's going to talk this afternoon, was second author on it. So they actually looked at asparagine on the arginine 534. They looked at cells and saw rescue. They looked at it on biallelic or 2 mutations and also saw rescue, although it's not as strong as it is when there's only one going on. We have a link on our website. So we have an FAQ on asparagine, and there's the link. So you can go and read all about it. And I know Ingrid already talked about it. And it has been studied in a related disorder to NARS1, where the enzyme is gone, and with some improvements there. But again, there's so much about asparagine we don't know, including actually finding it. It's actually very hard to find. I already talked about this. And then just to think about like, all right, if you have conversations with your clinicians or physicians about, one of these therapeutics, like here's some things maybe you might see in terms of changes, but they're going to be small, right? Because they're not working right on the underlying cause of NARS1, but they're working, somewhere downstream from that. That's all I got. Terry, are you asking me a question or are you telling me to get off stage? Oh. Yep. Yep, I think that's reasonable. I think it's, right, I look at each of these, I mean, they cross over in a lot of ways, right? Some of them have similar possible mechanisms. But I think that's the most important thing, right? Is thinking about what's best for you, your child, your family, right? Having the conversation with your clinicians because right, you're introducing something new. And if they're on other drugs, those are always things that you want to, consider and make sure that they're right, everything's being watched. I put together just like essentially this stuff in a handout that you can take to your clinician too. So that's all in one page because I have found that works best. We've done that for the asparagine trial as well. So collating the literature, summarizing it, and putting in a way that a clinician can understand and review. Because most of the time, if they've never heard about it, right, they're not gonna do it. So yeah. I'm gonna email them. Yeah. They're all electronic. Although I guess I could print them out. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I probably would go to my neurologist, or if you have a good pediatrician who's managing, right, some of the other, other symptoms that are coming around, right? It really depends on what your relationship is, right, with each of those, each of the practitioners that are caring for your child. I mean, most of the things, right, that you would see a difference in are neurologically based, right, or movement based. Right. But yeah, I think it's to me, it's probably the person that's managing your child's medications already too. Right. And you're seeing the most often. I mean, amantadine would be probably more likely be prescribed by like a neuropsych physician. Right. I would think, or like developmental peds, something along those lines. Yeah. I think it's really specific to what's, where you want where one of your biggest concerns is, right? And so, Terry, I'm just going to use Terry as an example over here because Grady's my personal guinea pig, which she has volunteered. But like for Grady, like I know movement's an issue and I know coordination's a huge issue. And I've watched him, right? Just some of his movements are very continuous and being able to be able to grab things or to move things, right? He's still very much like this. So like we've talked about like amantadine might be better for him, right? But I think that's where that conversation is with your clinician. That's going to be so helpful. Yeah, so most of these are going to take several weeks. Yep. And you don't want to try them all at once, right? You want to try one at a time. You got to like look for, some of that benefit and then, right, and then think about whether that's working or not, right? Taking it off if you wanted to try another one, right? Like you kind of go through it like stepwise. I've talked to James's physician too, by the way. I bet you guys don't know that. Okay. Yeah. I talk to everybody's doctors. If you give me their name, I will call them. Yeah, 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 yeah. Anything else? Nope. All right.